So first of all, I want to say thank you very much for taking time out your day to click on this video, and without further ado, I want to get straight into the review. Now first off, I want to talk a little bit about the open world. Wow, does it look great. From just a visual standpoint, the world looks very good. A mix of realism and a more cel-shaded art style works wonders here. For a game that pushes the Switch to its limits in graphical fidelity, I am impressed personally with just how good the game looks on the surface. The area in which you start the game, the Great Plateau, is great. It works as a tutorial area, guiding you to certain locations to teach you about the game's mechanics. The best part of this area, and the reason it works so well for this game specifically, is that you still have the freedom to tackle the tutorial obstacles as you wish. Now obviously this is only within reason, but you can take a different path, do things in a different order, and have a different experience to another individual, all in just the tutorial. The tutorial teaches you to wear the right clothing for the weather, how to attack enemies and how to cook, all without feeling at all restrictive. One of the game's biggest strengths in my eyes is the tutorial section of the game. One thing I feel many a Zelda fan is bound to notice is the many callbacks to Zelda's past throughout Hyrule. Like this ranch being Lon Lon Ranch from the video game Ocarina of Time, which I adore, and the map having many of its named locations based off a character or something in the Zelda series. There are many of these throughout the world, and it helps to not only connect the games, but make the world feel far more interesting. A part of the map is obscured, and then you go up a tower and activate it. But these towers don't take away from the world at all, in fact they add. They feel very much a part of the world and don't feel like they don't fit. But also, especially at night, you can see them from so far away, almost beckoning you to come see them without forcing you. You can actually beat the game without activating a single one, besides the one in the tutorial, that is. The weather in this game is done brilliantly. If it's raining, you can shield surf downhill easier and sneak easier due to the rain's noise, and this is extremely noticeable, but you also can't climb well at all in the rain. Lightning attacks also do more damage in the rain by far. When there is lightning, you can't have metal on your person showing, or the lightning will strike you down. The weather plays an amazing part in the world of Breath of the Wild. There are also some places and or elevations that have the need for either warm or cold gear. Aside from a lack of clothing options that I will get to later on in this review, the weather is done so very well in this game. Now throughout the open world you can find a plethora of these things called Korok seeds. Once collected you can trade them to get more inventory space for either your bows, swords or shields. There are a whopping 900 of these in the game, and they are done so very well. You stumble upon them all the time even without searching, and they never get boring as they're quick and simple. Although 900 may seem far too much, it isn't, as I believe the game doesn't want you to collect them all. The reason there are so many is so you can find them all throughout the world without the need for any HUD indicators or the annoyance of never being able to find a single one. Also, every time you get an inventory slot from a Korok seed, you have to pay extra for the next one. So for example, the first time you get an extra weapon space, it will be a single Korok, the next time is 2, and after 3, it keeps increasing, thus 50 seeds won't give you all the space you could possibly ever need. The on-screen HUD does little to take away from the beauty of the world. Everything seems needed and placed very well. Never once did the HUD distract me or feel overwhelming. A little issue I do have with the open world look, however, is these cool looking dragons. There's 3 of them throughout the game. I think it's a blue, green and red one, although I may be misremembering. And they are pretty much non-interactable at all. They do nothing in the world. I'm sure there's a cool lore reason as to why they're there. I personally do not know this, but I'm sure there is. And they look really, really cool. So it's not the biggest deal ever, but it just sucks that they're there. You see them from very early on, at least if you're doing some exploring. One thing I disliked about the exploration in Breath of the Wild is that at the end of every little secret area there is a shrine. I remember doing this side mission which involved me following statues that are supposed to guide you towards treasure. You're told that by an NPC. I followed them in a part of the desert that isn't mapped and it felt unique, but the treasure the quest spoke of was a shrine. The reason this is annoying is because not only are shrines very numerous anyway, with 120 of them in the game, the shrines aren't so unique from one another that I would be excited about finding another. This really impacts the exploration in the game in my opinion. The amount of shrines isn't the issue, but I would like some cool hidden areas or secrets not to be rewarded with a shrine each and every time. It can leave the world feeling samey and far more boring. Speaking of which, in this Zelda game there are 120 of these things called shrines. They are scattered throughout the world, and once found and completed give a currency that can be used to get either more health or stamina. Many say that these are a replacement for dungeons in older Zelda games, and if that is the case, they are a lousy replacement at that. My biggest issue is how they all look the same. After the 20th time looking at the same colour palette over and over with no change throughout the hours of runtime, I can't help but find myself bored. To tackle the shrines you are given a few different abilities. They are unlimited and only have but a quick cooldown between uses. The tools given to tackle shrines are solid. They can not only be used inside of shrines themselves, but also in the vast open world. Like in this clip where instead of cutting down trees with weapons that may break, I use the unlimited bombs to save me my weapon's durability. The biggest issue with these abilities you get for you to be able to tackle shrines is I don't think there is enough. There are only 5 if you don't include the camera or motorcycle spawner and amiibo scanner, and 2 of the 5 are simply different variations of the bomb ability, so one's a circular bomb and one's a more square bomb. So really there is 4 unique proper abilities. This, for how big the world is and how many shrines there are, is simply not enough. There is noticeably an issue in shrines as they will very often use the same trick again and again, as there aren't that many combinations of abilities that can feel different in 120 different shrines across the map. Slightly more if you include the DLC. Although rather rare, however, I did manage to do certain shrines in a way that I am sure the developers didn't intend, which is a nice feeling when pulled off. This is extremely rare, however. In around 50 or 60 shrines, I must have only done this a handful of times. With this said, I also want to mention that I did not complete all 120 shrines, not even close. I understand that some of you may say that I should beat all of them to have a clear picture of them, however I feel that they are so uninteresting later on in the game that I far prefer exploring the open world, and if shrines are so uninteresting that I can't even do half, I find that an issue in and of itself. So for myself personally, I find little to no need to explore all 120. You also get 1 spirit orb for completing a single shrine, and you have to accumulate 4 of them to get either slightly more stamina or slightly more health, and I think they could have just made this 1 instead of 4. That way you could cut over half the shrines, making them less repetitive in the process, as there is really no need for 120 shrines. The puzzles in the shrines themselves are done relatively well in isolation, and if included in a more interesting location, could have worked wonders to make shrines more enjoyable. Throughout your journey through the main story, you can take down 4 of what are called divine beasts. Before entering these behemoths, you have little things needed to be done, like surfing in sand and shooting at the feet while avoiding being electrocuted, or flying on a bird friend while taking down turrets. These 4 little introductions to the beasts are fine mission starters and don't take up much time at all. Although 3 of them use a bow, which may seem samey, I feel they all do enough and don't overstay their welcome. When taking down the defences, you gain access to the beast. This is one of only 4 times, 5 including the DLC, you get something akin to a dungeon throughout the game. First of all, I like how each beast looks different enough from shrines to have their own identity. That being said, all 4 beasts look the same inside to one another, having a problem shared by the shrines. They also have no unique enemies and an extreme lack of enemy variety in general. The puzzles themselves are fine, with few if any blowing me away, but after the first one, the rest seem far less interesting. That being said, you can tackle the beasts in any order, which is something I do like, however. Each beast also comes with a boss fight at the end, Like the Divine Beasts themselves, they all look remarkably similar and don't hold a candle to bosses from other Zelda titles. That being said, they all have unique abilities, but as you will possibly see in the gameplay, they have such a limited amount of abilities that they all start to feel samey once again. These bosses look the same in similar looking dungeons with a limited amount of unique puzzles due to not many abilities. I just feel that both the shrines and these Divine Beasts are a terrible replacement for the dungeons. That being said, there is a 5th dungeon not relating to a beast that is accessible through DLC content. The way you unlock this after purchasing the DLC is rather boring. You have to do 12 little trials the game gives you, and on top of that 12 other shrines unique to the DLC to be able to unlock the dungeon. On top of that, you need to repeat the previous 4 poor boss fights of the other previously mentioned beasts, but this time you have a limited inventory. They are not made any better by this. The only part of the setup I find cool in any way, shape or form is in the first little challenge you are given before even being able to do the 22 trials and shrines. You are given a weapon that one-hits any enemy, but you are also one-hit while you have it. When you have it, you cannot equip any other weapon as well. With this, you need to take on and defeat 4 enemy bases. Although nothing spectacular, I really did find this to be unique in a positive way. This intro should have been the only thing needed to unlock the new DLC dungeon, as the hours you need to spend after this is rather boring and uninteresting. The shrines aren't improved, and the trials involve stuff like time trials or defeat the enemies in a certain area. Acceptable, but having the shrines there as well make them feel far more boring as they would alone. The dungeon itself, I must say, is an improvement on the beasts however. Although not looking far more unique, the dungeon's puzzles are an improvement if only slightly. The reason I find this dungeon the best is because of the boss fight you get after beating it. It is the hardest boss in the game easily and has so many unique moves. It is by far the most interesting boss to fight in the entire game. I also love how it plays on your expectations, as you have seen these figures at the end of every single shrine you have done throughout the entire game, and they speak to you a little bit, but they do not move at all, and then they give you a spirit orb and then you leave. But this one actually starts to move, and then you end up fighting it, and it really was a cool reveal to what is the best fight in the game by far. The boss also looks far more unique than other bosses, and it may not be the best boss in the Zelda series, but it is an absolute improvement from the previous 4 dungeon bosses. While speaking of bosses, I feel it appropriate to mention the 2 other true bosses in the game, first being Master Koga, who you find after sneaking through the only true stealth section in the entire game. That isn't meant as a criticism, but the boss at the end is utterly awful. He is part of the Yiga clan, a clan who throughout the game, from both NPCs and your own experience, are very much trouble. If you get caught sneaking through their base, you will be met with heavy resistance, and in the open world you can be surprised by a member, which you need to then fight. That all being said, the build up to this joke of a boss is better than the payoff. Although I am glad he looks more unique than many of the other bosses in the game, he is played off as a joke and is by far the easiest boss in the game. I don't believe harder is always better, but this guy, after all this build up, is so disappointing it hurts. The other boss or bosses are the final 2 fights with Ganon, the big enemy of the game. The first one is underwhelming, as he looks very similar to the Divine Beast bosses and isn't really engaging to fight at all. If you do all of the optional Divine Beasts, which I would like to quickly mention, you can fight Ganon as soon as you beat the tutorial, which is so cool and adds to the exploration of the game. But if you do all 4 Divine Beasts before defeating Ganon, which is what most people would probably do on a first playthrough, the boss actually starts with half its health, as the Divine Beasts work together after being uncorrupted by you, and then the beasts start shooting at Ganon. So this is cool, as what you did in the world affected this fight in some way, which I really like. The fight itself though, from the moves he uses to the way he looks, is very underwhelming. He is also rather easy too. After defeating this monster, you get introduced to the true final boss, Dark Beast Ganon. He is said to be the incarnation of true malice, which sounds so epic, and the look of this monster is a sight to behold. That being said, just look at the gameplay of the fight. You ride around on a horse, shooting weak points, avoiding his impossible not to avoid attacks. Between this and Master Koga, I am unsure who is worse. This is so sad for a final confrontation to the big bad at the end. I will say, however, the build up to the fight with this inspirational music and words from Princess Zelda is really epic, and the boss looks really cool, but in actual gameplay it's just so very disappointing. And it's probably technically the easiest boss in the game because you can't really fail it.
He has given up on reincarnation and assumed his pure, enraged form. If set free upon our world, the destruction will be unlike anything ever seen before.
So going on to combat, a major nitpick for me about this game is just the same feel of the combat after fighting each standard enemy a handful of times. You can swing a sword a few different ways, you can block, shoot a bow and dodge. If you dodge at the perfect time, you can perform a flurry rush. This slows down time and allows you to do some major damage to your foe. You can also perfect block, which allows you to either stagger or fire back a projectile at an enemy. Now, I'm sure to other Zelda games that this is solid combat, and to the ones I've played, it is better than all of those. But for myself, it felt repetitive and uninteresting after a while, as there is only a few ways to defeat an enemy in the entire game. To be fair, I also forgot to mention slowing down time whilst you can jump in midair with a bow, or whilst you're just in midair with a bow in general. Time slows down, but still, the combat is easily acceptable, especially considering what came before, and I want to stress it is the best combat in a Zelda game at least I've played. But I just felt that something was missing in my playtime. I also forgot to mention that you can actually use the abilities I mentioned earlier to help you with shrines, like the bombs, in combat. But the reason I call this a nitpick of mine is because the combat in my eyes is in no way bad. In fact, it's the best in a Zelda game I've played. I mean, I've not played many, but it is the best in a Zelda game I've played, so maybe I'm just very greedily wanting more. However, I just didn't feel satisfied with the gameplay personally. I will say, however, that there is a lack of enemy variety in this game. The world of this game is far bigger than that of, let's say, Ocarina of Time from 1988, but somehow this game has significantly less, and I mean significantly less, enemy variety. More isn't always better, but after the 5th hour of this game, you have seen pretty much, if not every standard enemy you will fight throughout the game. There are variants of certain enemies, but they are pretty much the same in design, just a different colour, and you fight them the exact same way. Instead of a fire-breathing lizard, it's an ice-breathing lizard. You'll still just dodge to the side and hit it, it doesn't change anything. I also find the enemy AI is average, acceptable but nothing special, even compared to 30-year-old games in the series like Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask. Something I think many people dislike is weapons breaking after extended use. I say extended, but they break extremely quickly. I don't mind this in theory, but my big issue comes from there being no way to repair almost broken equipment in the game. So if a sword, shield or bow you like is on the verge of breaking, you will either never use it or just accept it. Having weapons be breakable is a fine feature and I don't dislike it entirely, but it would make sense to have a vendor of some sort that could repair certain weapons. If Nintendo thought this would be too overpowered, or they really wanted people to use a variety of weapons, they could have made the vendor rather expensive to use, so you can't do it early game. It just sucks when I have a cool weapon that fits the outfit I have perfectly, but just to not be able to use the weapon out of fear it will eventually break. I also do believe that finding a cool weapon isn't as awesome as it is in the older Zelda games, as aside from the Master Sword, that weapon will eventually break. Speaking of which, the Master Sword feels far less epic than in other games in the series. It has this feature that makes it a regular but average strength sword when fighting regular enemies. But when fighting anything affected by Calamity Ganon, the main antagonist, the sword unleashes its true potential and deals double the damage as well as lighting up. This is cool looking and an interesting way to make the sword not as OP against weaker enemies. That being said, even when the sword is at full power, it is still not the strongest weapon in the game. This makes the epic nature of the Master Sword feel far more dulled. Not to mention that although the sword cannot break, it can overheat, thus when it's overused has a cooldown. I dislike how not epic the Master Sword feels in this game compared to others. One thing you will be doing a lot in your playthrough is climbing. Climbing in this game is done to perfection. Not only can you climb almost anything in the world, but having to manage your stamina consumption and stop to scour the rocks for your best route makes the climbing extremely engaging. You have to stop to rest. If you have lower stamina, you may take an alternative path to another, and as mentioned previously, the weather can also affect how you traverse the walls. The climbing in the game is the best I've experienced in gaming and is the game's best feature bar none, in my opinion. Now for myself, as I alluded to earlier, I believe there is a lack of clothing items throughout the game. Even including clothing you get from DLC, there isn't enough considering the scope of the world. If you want clothing to help against cold or heat, or any other attribute, like clothing that increases your stealth, there are very few options. I will say however that in game you have the ability to dye clothes to a colour of your choosing, and this gives a little more variety than there would be otherwise, but there still feels like a major lack of garments throughout the game. Throughout the game you gain 4 abilities from fallen comrades, that I will dive into more when it comes to the story portion of the review. There is one ability that raises you from the dead, like Quick Revive in Call of Duty Zombies, and if you get that reference, you're cool. But it's very self-explanatory, it's got the longest recharge time out of any of these 4 abilities. You can also get one that, when holding down the jump button for an extended period of time, which is difficult to do by accident, you have this gust of wind that propels you into the air, and has the shortest cooldown out of any of these abilities. It's very, very useful to get to higher elevation very, very quickly. There's also another ability that, when charging up a weapon, you have the ability to strike down your foe with lightning. It deals damage to enemies and can insta-kill weaker enemies, but not only that. Against boss enemies, and I haven't found a single boss, including the final boss, aside from the last beast Ganon fight that I spoke of earlier, which I was a bit underwhelmed by. With every other boss in the game, including the other Ganon fight, you can use this ability to stun the enemy and get a few free hits in whilst also damaging them with the ability itself, and is the second fastest to recharge. Very useful. My only downside with this is that you activate it by charging up a weapon attack, so it is quite easy to do by accident, but you can actually cancel out of your attack to make sure you don't use it by accident, but it is still a bit finicky. They could have made it a different control possibly, but overall it's fine. The 4th and final ability, however, is by far my least favourite. Not because of what it does, it gives you a shield which pretty much acts as an instant perfect block. My issue with this ability is not what it does, it's how you activate it. As long as you have it equipped, when you get your shield out at any point, it just automatically comes into play. So you cannot use your shield without using this ability unless you just completely disable it from the menu in your key items section, which you can do, but you shouldn't have to constantly go in and out of menus just to not use this when you do not want to use it, if that makes sense. If you haven't played this game at this point, it will mean not much to you, but it's akin to the iron boots in Ocarina of Time where you have to keep equipping them, non-equipping them, equipping them, not equipping them in the menus, and it's just annoying and time consuming, and I feel like they could have easily had it so maybe if you hold out your shield and click a certain button, then the ability is active. A very small issue I have, as it doesn't heavily impact the game at all, is the FPS. Drops of the FPS happen very often, and in certain areas, like in the Korok Forest, which you'll probably see in the gameplay from now, it constantly happens. You cannot go more than 5 seconds through the Korok Forest without a major FPS drop. Because the game is not only a Switch exclusive that came out on its release, but is also very good in general, it does seem a bit more excusable, but it is something I would be remiss not to mention, especially as the game I believe is only 30 FPS, so it's not 60 anyway, and thus I believe it makes it even more noticeable. Horses are a way to traverse the open world. Although I am glad they are in the game, they do feel underused, at least for myself. For myself, I struggle to say anything about the horses as they're simply fine. Not poor, not good, although if you have the DLC, you can teleport your horse to you, which makes them far more usable and better than average as a result, but most will not have this I assume, so overall the horses are absolutely fine. Once you defeat all 4 beasts, but before beating Ganon himself, you can unlock a motorcycle. This bike is only available through the purchase of DLC, but when purchased it is a very long process to get still. Earlier in the video I mentioned the best boss in the game. Well, once you defeat them, you gain access to this bike as a reward. This is a very long task as previously mentioned, but once you have it, it's easily better than any horse in the game. You can spawn it any time you want, aside from a few locations. It is fast, can go up harsh terrain, with its only downside being it is only available at what is pretty much the end of the game. It does need to be refueled, however it takes so very little to refuel, thus it's almost pointless to mention. A few collected common monster parts and it's back on the road. I like how it doesn't make the horses completely irrelevant either, as it takes a very long time to get, and is only available right at the last step of the game. I also just want to briefly mention a few things like how you can cook in this game, and I think cooking is done very well, but I just couldn't think of anything to say going deeper into it. But you cook to give yourself buffs like heat resistance, better stealth, more damage, and the obvious one being more health, and you can mix a lot of ingredients, and I think it's done very well. Shield surfing is pretty cool. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I like shield surfing quite a bit. And the reason that enemies constantly respawn in the game is because of something called a blood moon, which is explained by Ganon. Like he uses his power to like conjure up enemies, I suppose. And I think that's pretty fine. I do love the build up to it, the sounds that happen. It sounds like a reversed kind of sound, but it might just straight up be a reverse sound. I'm not even sure, but it's very, very cool, and it's a decent little explanation as to why monsters constantly respawn at the same camps over and over again. From the rendition of Zelda's Lullaby in Ganon's castle. To the footsteps of Link, the sound of the game is solid throughout. I liked the sound of being spotted by a guardian, as it feels tense early on in the game, giving you a sense that Link is not ready to fight Ganon yet. Although talking about the sound design in games is one of my least favourite parts about reviewing games, even I picked up on some cool sounds throughout. I will link, below a video by YouTuber Scruffy, who does an in-depth breakdown of certain sounds and gives them in layman's terms. I highly suggest watching it, as my section on sound is so very short, but overall the sound was never an issue in the game for me throughout my playtime. The story of this game is possibly the biggest flaw. It was only a month ago at the time of this video being uploaded that I played Ocarina of Time for the very first time, and comparatively, this story is not even close. The story is set 100 years after an event called the Great Calamity that decimated the land and killed many. Link wakes up after being asleep for the past 100 years after being mortally wounded. He wakes with no memories, and the goal throughout both the main story is to slowly piece together these memories to tell the story of what happened all those years ago to both you and your allies. This sounds rather cool in concept, but in execution is very lacking. You learn throughout the game of 4 comrades of the different races that were chosen to pilot the 4 divine beasts. These beasts were corrupted by Calamity Ganon when he attacked 100 years ago, and the 4 champions fell trying to defeat the corrupted beast they once piloted. This plot point is pretty cool and makes Ganon seem like a real threat. Once you remove the corruption from each of these divine beasts, you get an interaction with each of the spirits of your fallen comrades, which is sweet, especially with Mipha, who loved Link. That being said, I feel that there is a far bigger opportunity for these scenes to be far more hard-hitting. They added some cutscenes later in DLC to try to expand these characters a little, but at that they failed for me. These characters have so much potential and it wasn't realised in this game. I will say though, after helping each of the 4 out, they weaken the boss a little at the end of the game, and they give you the 4 powers that I mentioned earlier on in the video. The voice acting for these characters also seemed a little off, seeming bored when not supposed to, or awkward when 2 characters are supposed to be best friends. I urge you to look up all memories, including DLC, of the game, to possibly understand my point more clearly. The only voice I find to be utterly abysmal is King Rome's.
The Great Calamity was merciless. It devastated everything in its path, lo, a century ago. It was then that my life was taken away from me. And since that time...
I'm also talking about the English voice acting specifically here. The inheritors of their powers 100 years later are not at all interesting. Each one is as forgettable as the next. These alive characters feel more dead than the dead ones. They share all the negatives of the other 4 without any of the positives. Totally forgettable, with the only relatively okay one of the bunch being Sidon. He is the younger brother of Mipha, who died 100 years prior. He is still very poor comparatively to the other champions, however. Zelda herself has cool moments. She speaks to you telepathically throughout the game, but not enough for it to be annoying. She shares the similar issue for me with the voice acting, but has some cool lines, especially during the final confrontation with Dark Beast Ganon. The ending leaves you teased, wanting more, in the best way possible. Although not perfect, I like Zelda in the game as much as the other 4 older champions, if not more. Link does canonically eventually beat Ganon, which is rather humorous, as Link, Zelda, and the 4 champions, with the help of the entire kingdom, couldn't defeat Ganon, but Link alone is enough to defeat him after 100 years rest. I believe the reason is that Ganon made a surprise attack corrupting friendly machines and the divine beasts, and I also don't find this to be a negative at all, just something a little humorous that I thought to myself and wanted to mention. Link does not talk in the game, and aside from rare occasions, seems emotionless. I think this works, however, as not only is there a lore reason he doesn't speak, being quote-unquote, so he remains steadfast so that he doesn't succumb to the burdens of being the chosen hero, end quote, but it also makes for a gripping scene when he shows emotion in a scene knowing he usually is very blank-faced. The story has many a flaw and is nothing compared to other Zelda games like Ocarina of Time, but I feel like it is overhated personally and find certain aspects of it rather solid. I mean, how cool does a story sound? A hero awakening after a century's rest to find his kingdom destroyed. He then goes on a path to defeat the pure form of malice, to save the kingdom from being truly extinct, and to save the king's daughter. That is super badass. NPCs throughout Hyrule are done well enough. Very few stand out, but the ones that do can be a little interesting. I personally do feel, however, unless you are a mega fan of Zelda games and want to dive extremely deep, the NPCs for the most part will be at the very least serviceable, but nothing special. That being said, I did like some of the side content. There are 2 missions I can think of specifically, one very brief one in which you race a man up a mountain, which for my lack of stamina was actually quite challenging, and a mission in which you help a town go from a virtual non-existence to bustling, albeit this is quite a fetch questy mission. But it ends rather sweetly, and although neither of these 2 or any other side mission are brilliant by any stretch, I honestly can't say I was extremely disappointed in what I received. Overall, Breath of the Wild is a game I think very highly of. I find the game to be absolutely breathtaking in some aspects, but believe many people overlook clear flaws from what isn't a masterpiece. Obviously, this is just my opinion, and I am not at all trying to act as if I am being factually correct. So please in the comments below, feel free to discuss your favourite part of the game, but please be friendly. Thank you for watching.